May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. Well, good morning, people of St. John's Cathedral. I am so delighted to be with you in sunny Los Angeles. I get to bring you greetings from the other side of the country, from Washington, D.C., where just yesterday morning I was with my own bishop, Bishop Marion Buddy, not at the big cathedral on the hill, but down in a place where folks don't typically go. So not in the place where she got to be known as that woman who preached that sermon, but really at the heart of go-go in the hood. I convinced Bishop Buddy to come down and celebrate MLK east of the river, as we call it, in Anacostia, in a part of the city that tells its own story out loud. The rough part of the story, the part of the story that company doesn't always want to be ready to hear. I don't know about you here in LA, but it seems that every urban center has a neighborhood that tells that part of the story, loud and clear. And no matter how much we try to fight it or reframe it with our best efforts, with stubborn persistence, all of the concerns of neighbors who are struggling and failing to thrive come to the surface. It might be a cliche, but in any city where there is a Martin Luther King Street, there will be something to the antithesis of the vision, or at least the words of peace and overcoming happening there. And yet, this is the irony, that places of lack are also places of richness. That's what I learned in Anacostia, and that might be what you learn here. That's part of the story, the reality of Dr. King's movement, from Birmingham to Montgomery to Atlanta to Watts. Communities that demand America's honest assessment, that want to cash that blank check from America, that realize the worth of people who've been excluded. Those are communities worth fighting for. Not just for jobs or locations, but for a sense of hope, for futures of children. So as you all begin your second century, is that? Surrounded by 70,000 unhoused people with your own struggles, kind of like we know in Anacostia, I bet you there's a little piece of Dr. King's dream that echoes back, way back to that wonderful Exodus reading we heard from Moses, with lessons that remind us how God loves us in community. Now Moses, this is not the version we hear very often. It's one where Moses is reluctant. He doesn't know if he really wants to be a leader of oppressed people. He doesn't really know if he wants to hear their groaning. Moses and Dr. King, I think, might have had that in common at some point. Who am I that I should go and talk to Pharaoh? Little old me? Doubts boil down. They are part of the story that we don't hear a lot, especially on King holiday, a holiday of triumph in the I Have a Dream speech. But really, in 1955, Dr. King had just moved from Atlanta, his home, to Montgomery. And he was really young, 26 years old. He didn't know the church members that well. He didn't know the vestry. He didn't know the players in town. He barely knew Rosa Parks. But there was an organizer named E.D. Nixon, a very experienced civil rights leader and an activist. And he called together a lot of pastors to recruit them to this idea, a bus boycott. And when this organizer got all the pastors in the room and said, will you commit? Will you come with me? Some said, yeah. He got to Dr. King, and Dr. King said, let me call you back. Exact quote. Reluctance, I think, is a part of becoming a Moses. It's how God works with leaders in communities, assuring them, maybe frightening them with their burning bushes, but saying, know that the words that come out of your mouth will be my words. Know this, that I, God, I am who I am. The first leader of God's people to come out of bondage, well, he'd been a little well-adjusted to the sight of oppression. He'd been used to the Israelites in servitude. He'd been well-adjusted to the whims of the taskmasters and their violence. This might have been something going on in Dr. King's head. It's just a lay of the land that people are suffering, that folks can't ride buses. It's just the way things are. But here's the counterintuitive wisdom. God never calls the confident. God calls the reluctant and makes them confident. God doesn't call the ready. God calls the uncertain and makes us ready. Eventually, we're going to all have our readjustment moments, a point of reluctance where we have choices to accept God on a big, crazy mission or to go back to ignoring it all. Who am I? Little old me? But God is ready to say, I'm calling you. Your reluctance is not disqualifying, it's confirming. Now, near the end of Dr. King's life, he was invited to give a keynote speech, and you won't believe this, at the American Academy of Psychologists. He gave a speech after winning the Nobel Prize on this whole concept of being what he called maladjusted. He highlights to the psychologists that they kind of recently invented this word maladjustment to name a problem, that one could be maladjusted or diseased or not centered in reality. But Dr. King wondered out loud, what if that's just how people are supposed to be? Good people, people of consciousness, people of faith, perhaps they should be a little maladjusted. Perhaps that's the alternative to inequity or cruelty, to heartbreak, to seeing it all around them and thinking, I don't know how I feel about that. In his speech, he even joked that America was ready for a new national organization, the National Association of the Maladjusted. He called on people to take up this call and this cause, to rename their dysregulation, to be proud of it. He said, if people of goodwill must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination or segregation, we should stay maladjusted. We must never adjust ourselves to bigotry. We should stay maladjusted. Never adjust ourselves to economic inequities that take necessities from those with the few and give luxuries to the many. What if we stayed maladjusted instead? I love that idea. He wasn't a psychologist, but he was nudging all of us to think creatively. Isn't it better to be maladjusted than to just get used to the way things are? To get weary, to get overwrought and numb with all the news and fake news, to be unsettled. Whatever state or city or county or country you're in, perhaps it's better to be a little maladjusted than to ignore how folks flounder while others flourish. I like this concept of being maladjusted because it reminds me that somehow there's someone nudging us to the right, to look to the light, to make sure that while those are full, we're a little concerned about those who are still hungry. We're maladjusted. And Dr. King, I don't think he got the concept out of the thin air. It didn't come from nowhere. His story of learning to be a leader centers around folks who were maladjusted with him. Because I wonder why. You ever think why we put such a show on for the King holiday. Here we are, it was first in '86 that it was a federal holiday, yet we struggle to see ourselves into it, to see ourselves amongst the community. I think that gets at the heart of what was happening in the civil rights movement, a community in Alabama that pulls its leader, that joins in the call of God, that literally knocks on the door of perhaps a priest, a pastor, or a leader, and encourages them in the way community wants to go. Because if you don't know your Alabama history, when Dr. King walked into this church and said to the organizers, "I'll call you back," people were already moving. They were already organizing, and it was a lot of women. There was Mary Fairbanks. In '46, she started running off mimeograph copies, doing her Bible story circle with the ladies and the teachers. They were preparing. They were practicing being maladjusted. Mary and the others at the Dexter Avenue Church, while they were saying their prayers and polishing the altar silver, Viola White and Joanne Robinson, the sisterhood group, they would rehearse in their minds what it was like to not be adjusted to the way things were. And so they were gardening in front of the church and cooking the lunches and the dinners, and they went to an organizing workshop at the Highlander School, and they met September Clark, and they learned about taking their maladjustment to the streets. And they learned about facing dangerous police in the streets. They learned about how to be quiet and get a message across to those who are elected. These women kept knitting together a community of hopeful maladjustment. They learned what to do when their feelings and they just get fed up with how things are and the police and the brutality of it all. And they learned how to listen when teenagers like Claudette Colvin went out and sat down on a bus and got arrested a decade before Rosa Parks. They became a community of organized maladjusters filled with relationships. And when they got that new pastor one day and called him late at night and said, "You know, any thought about what that E.D. Nixon said?" Well, he did pick up the phone that time and said, "All right, you called me back." Dr. King was called back into a community of folks who wanted to see the world a different way. I take that lesson for all of us in inner city Anacostia, and maybe for you here in St. John's, when we're asking, what is it that we want to be? What kind of people of God in the city should we be? Are we doing it as a community of learners, a community willing to listen, a community willing to hear stories in which people are just maladjusted and yet sustained faithfully through each other? This is where I love the Bible. It's so surprising. It has in it its own little manual for community organizing. I'll say that as someone who helped write Sacred Ground and Calling for Transformation. God points his little ways of organizing and how to help Moses be maladjusted. Right here in Exodus, he has all the verbs. First, I have observed the misery of my people. You look and see. What's going on? How many people are hungry, thirsty? I see them. Second, I identify where the problem starts. The misery of the people in Egypt. They are victimized by their taskmasters. Cut the issue. See the problem. Okay. Second, I've heard their cry. God listens, really listens to the personal call and experience of people. Okay, the third organizer technique. And I heard their cry on account of their work in Egypt, meaning God sees everyone's role in a system, not just as individuals, but as a whole group. How is it working together? Fourthly, indeed, I know their sufferings. God knows this important role that the source of all of our Christian ethics deep in our bones comes from knowing when our friends are suffering, knowing when our neighbors are hurt, knowing when our family, near and far, aren't doing all right. And fifth, God teaches Moses, and whatever you do, point towards hope. I will bring them up and out of that land to a good and broad land with milk and honey. You gotta have a vision. You gotta have a place to go. And yes, Moses first says, well, who am I to do that? But Moses got the message. He followed the counterintuitive wisdom. He followed the steps. I think you got a little maladjusted at the moment. This is what happened with Moses, and it happened with Dr. King, I dare say, down at Dexter Avenue Church, listening and following the path of those women who listened, and identifying and understanding where to identify and pointing towards a mountaintop. That very famous sermon from the night before he was killed, he mentioned this. You know, wherever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, Pharaoh had a favorite formula for doing it. Dr. King said this, what was his formula? It was to keep the slaves fighting amongst themselves. But whenever the slaves got together, something happened inside Pharaoh's court, and even Pharaoh could not hold the slaves in slavery any longer. Pharaohs have strategies of their own, not listening, not building, but causing division. Dr. King knew it. Moses knew it. Now we know it. It doesn't matter where we come from. It doesn't matter if we're filled with stress or strain. It doesn't matter if some of us are citizens and some of us are immigrants. It doesn't matter who immigrated the right way or the wrong way. It doesn't matter who's housed or unhoused. Pharaoh's strategy is always to get us to point at one another, to not listen, to not hold together. It's the strategy of being adjusted to the way things are. And yet, St. John's, I wonder if in our trek to become really maladjusted people, we do what Dr. King said, the opposite of Pharaoh is to come together, to be unified, to be a people that not knits itself together, that binds itself together in its maladjustment, but also in love. Because when the slaves get together, that's the beginning of the end of Pharaoh's court. I think that's why at the end of Dr. King's life, he was also echoing what we heard in this gospel. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you. It's not just a nice sentiment, not something for saints, but I think those who know, you really know that what Jesus is teaching us is, what if you love your enemies, not as emotion, but a strategy, not as a feeling, but with purpose. The presiding bishop I used to work for used to say, if it's not about love, it's not about God. On to this love of God hang all the laws and all the prophets. And here's the thing. When we love our enemies, as Dr. King knew, we are held together in love. We do it so that we get better. We do it so that we become transformed. We do it so that we don't become defined by hatred. When we love our enemies, we see them not as strangers, but neighbors, as Ephesians would say. Our enemies across lines of division or politics, our enemies created by a system that pits us once against the other, kind of like Pharaoh. But when we love them, we tap into that cosmic power that is this love of God. I think the women of Dexter Avenue who ran that mimeograph machine knew that. It wasn't the hatred of bus drivers that caused the Montgomery boycott, but a love of their communities, of their children trying to get to school, of their friends and family getting to work. They weren't consumed by hatred, they were transformed by love. For everyone here who is comfortable where they are, who is properly adjusted, this invitation to be maladjusted is an invitation to love the neighbor and the stranger. These counterintuitive lessons we celebrate today in Dr. King's message and legacy because the struggle's not over. We celebrate them today because we haven't quite arrived at the broad land flowing with milk and honey. We're still on our way. We celebrate because the celebration itself is a type of resistance. When Pharaoh wants to keep people enslaved, He makes them weary. He makes them give up hope. He makes them point at one another. But when we come together to celebrate, to sing spirituals, to hear stories of salvation, when we name ancestors, when we eat together, when we declare that despite everything we have come this far by faith, then we are not afraid. I think that's why it matters. I think that's why I'm thrilled to be here. I think that's why we are reminding ourselves today that we've come this far to be where we are, maladjusted folks, at our own city on the hill of Los Angeles, when I go back to my city on the hill of Anacostia, to remind all of those who are in our sight, to think creatively, to be a little unsettled, to be maladjusted. And it is okay to be reluctant leaders. God still loves us. We can choose community anyways. A community of individuals who are waiting to be heroes, who are waiting to be formed, who are learning to love our enemies. We have choices, and this choice is ours. And at this moment, we can remember that God's reality will come. It will happen, and all of our hands are needed on that plow. As Dr. King said in his final speech, we do get to choose to act. And if we don't, we might be dragged down into that long, dark, shameful corridor of history. But the alternative is to choose a beautiful, better struggle for a new world. The future is in our hands. As God said, we all get to observe the misery of those around us. We all get to ask, who, me? But more importantly, we all get to answer, I will go. I will be the one who receives the words of God into my mouth. I will be the one who puts my hand on the plow, and I will be the one that gets reminded, on that mountain, I will love and worship the Lord all the days of my life. Amen.